I've worked the night shift at Hollow Creek Station for nearly 10 years. And I can say with certainty that nothing out here ever changes. This whole place is a relic, rotting from the inside out. It is perched in the valley between two mountain ridges, where fog likes to settle thick as wool. Once, long before my time, it had been a pulse point of the region. Freight came through in constant streams, passenger trains stopped nearly every hour, and the little town around it thrived on the constant motion of wheels and smoke. Now, it's a graveyard. The schedules are out of date by decades. Half the tracks have weeds sprouting through the ties, and the platforms smell of rust and rain. But my company, in its stubbornness, keeps a skeleton crew manning the station. 4 men to keep a corpse breathing. There was me, Jonah, Alice, and Frank. We checked the signal lights, kept the switches from freezing, and filed empty reports into binders no one would ever read. On some nights, I wondered if the higher-ups even remembered this place existed. And the strangest thing was how easily we settled into it. Routine quickly became our anchor. Jonah had a way of filling the dead hours with jokes. Half of them were crude, the other half was even worse. Alice would grumble and correct him, his voice pinched with that bureaucrat's pride. Like, if he kept the logbook neat enough, the world might still care. Frank mostly slept through his shifts, claiming he would wake up at the snap of a finger if anything serious happened. Though we all knew better. And me, I was the quiet one, content to watch and listen, to drink bad coffee and mark the time. We weren't friends in the way men are outside of work, but closeness grows in strange soil. Long nights blur the edges of resentment, and repetition makes familiarity feel like comfort. We existed in a rhythm, Jonah making Alice sigh, Alice keeping score, Frank snoring, and me pretending to monitor the radio. It was boring, but also stable, and after years of it, I almost believed it would go on forever. On that particular night, rain had been falling since dusk, and the roof rattled with it. The water ran in steady rivers down the cracked concrete outside, and inside our office, the air was thick with the smell of damp coats and old paper. The radio hissed softly in my corner. Jonah sat with his boots up on the desk, thumbing through a magazine that looked ready to fall apart. Alice hunched over the logbook, his pen scratching uselessly as he filled out a column no one would ever read. And finally, Frank was on the bench, mouth open, head tilted down over his face. It was so ordinary it felt untouchable. Then the whistle blew. I thought at first it was the wind, a trick of the storm maybe, howling through the eaves. But no, it had a tone to it, a sound too long, too low to be mistaken for anything else. It was a train whistle. All of us froze, Jonah lowered his magazine. Alice's pen stopped mid-stroke, and Frank snorted awake and sat up. That, Jonah's voice cracked, and he tried to laugh it off. That was a train. It can't be, Alice muttered, already flipping through his book of schedules. He knew as well as the rest of us it was pointless, but for him it was a reflex. He needed the numbers to say what reality could not. Sure sounded like one, I said, though my stomach had already gone cold. The four of us simply waited. The rain thudded on the roof. The lamps buzzed overhead. And Frank rubbed his eyes. Then this whistle came again, closer this time. A long, mournful cry that seemed to rattle in the glass panes of the office windows. Jesus, Frank muttered, pushing himself off the bench. Haven't heard one of those in years. Jonah gave a crooked grin, though his eyes were wide. Guessed the old girl's not as dead as we thought. Alice simply snapped the book shut. There's nothing. No scheduled arrivals, no transfers, no unsignaled freight. Doesn't change the fact that it's out there, Frank said. And if it's on our line, it's our problem. He made it sound like an order, though I knew the edge in his voice came from the same unease I felt myself. We went out together, pulling on our coats and stepping into the night. The storm hit us hard. The rain, the fog, and this endless dark. Our lanterns only cast pale circles that barely pierced the mist. And the station behind us looked even more dead under the storm. The walls were streaked with weather, and the platforms deserted. Then came the sound, the churn of wheels, the clank of iron, and the hiss of steam. A vibration rose under our boots, growing stronger with each second. Then, through the fog, a light bloomed. Not the bright white of a headlamp, but something duller, orange, like fire behind thick smoke. It swelled, swallowed the mist, and then the shape came. It was vast and black, the front of an engine forcing itself out of the night. The train was enormous. The iron sides gleamed slick with rain. It was scarred with rust, and its edges were warped. Chains rattled along its length as it crawled past. Car after car, stretching further than the lantern's beam could reach. Its headlamp was a blind eye, its glow sickly and distorted. It stopped with a shriek that drilled through my skull, the brakes screaming against the tracks. Steam hissed from its vents, rolling over us in choking waves. We simply stood there, 4 men against a machine that should not have existed. Then the nearest car's door slid open with a groan. A breath of air spilled out, hot and foul, reeking of rot and something chemical that burned my throat. I turned my head, gagging, but the smell didn't go away. It clung to me, heavy and cloying, like the exhale of something alive. No one came out. No conductor stepped forward. No passengers shuffled onto the platform. The train simply waited. Jonah tried for humor, though his voice shook. Well, guess she's ours tonight. Alice whispered, almost to himself. It's not on the schedule. It's not anywhere. Frank straightened his shoulders, though his face had gone pale. It's still a train. We are railwaymen. It is our job to inspect. The others looked at him like he had lost his mind, but I kind of understood. He wasn't speaking out of duty. He was speaking because the alternative, the thought of turning away, was somehow worse. We stood in the rain, the four of us, lanterns flickering in our hands, staring at that yawning black door. And then, as if drawn by some force we couldn't resist, we climbed aboard. The first thing I noticed when we stepped inside was the air. Not just foul, heavy. It clung in my throat, slick as grease. My lantern flames shrank, sputtering like it was fighting to breathe. The car was dim, lined with cracked leather seats that were bolted to warped floorboards. Dust layered every surface, though it didn't look like normal dust. It was dark, sticky, almost like ash that smeared instead of lifting. The windows were caked so thick the storm outside was reduced to a vague smear of light and shadow. Jonah tried to cut the silence. Well, he said, running his hand across the seatback. Seen worse. His voice didn't carry right. The sound felt dampened, like the walls were drinking it in. Alice bent low, studying the brass fittings at the end of a row. His pen was still tucked behind his ear, a habit he couldn't shake. These aren't company issue. Gauge is wrong. Bolts don't match. Who cares? Jonah muttered. Place just needs a dust rag. But Alice was already crouching, running a hand along the floor seams, tapping the boards with the edge of his boot. That was Alice, bury fear under procedure. If it wasn't in his logbook, he would invent it. Frank swung his lantern wider, his shoulders squared. Seats are bolted in fine, frames solid, woods holding up. He pulled at one of the overhead straps, and it tore loose in his hand with a shriek of rotten leather. All right, he muttered, tossing it aside. Not that solid. We fanned out in pairs, lanterns bobbing, every man falling into old rhythms. We had been through so many inspections over the years, checking bearings, latches, windows and couplings, that our hands moved by muscle memory. It was almost comforting, like slipping into a language we all still knew. I rubbed at one of the windows, trying to clear enough grime to see through. But my rag came away black, wet, and streaked with something that smelled like burnt hair. I wiped harder, and for half a heartbeat, I saw outside. Not rain, not storm, but a blur of black shapes rolling past. Too fast to focus on, like shadows pressed against glass. My stomach lurched, and I stepped back from the window. By the time I looked again, there was nothing. Just my face in the smeared paint, pale and uncertain. Jonah was whistling low under his breath, pretending at calm as he checked the luggage racks. Empty, he said, though he sounded disappointed. Could have used a souvenir. Alice snapped at him without looking up. Focus! On what? Dust? Jonah flicked his rack against the seat, watching the suit puff into the air. That's not exactly riveting. It's our job, Alice said sharply, though his hand trembled as he scribbled notes onto the corner of his logbook. Every detail matters. Frank had crouched at the far end of the aisle, inspecting the door. The handle's rusted, but it should still give. Come, help me with this. Jonah joined him, both men heaving against the iron slab. The hinges screamed but didn't yield. Stuck, Jonah panted, kicking the base. Figures. Alice straightened, his voice tight. The through doors are never locked. That's regulation. Maybe it warped shut. Frank spat to the side. It's an old car. The metal shifts. It's still not right, Alice muttered, chewing at his lip. The silence after his words pressed too hard. Even Jonah stopped trying to fill it in. The four of us stood in the half-light, breath loud, the smell of oil and char thick in our noses. Then the floor gave a faint shiver beneath our boots. At first I thought it was just a storm, the wind buffeting the car. But then the sound came, a groan so deep it rattled in my bones, followed by the unmistakable lurch of motion. The whole train shuddered forward. Hold up, Alice stumbled, catching himself on a seat. Who's at the engine? None of us answered, because we all knew the truth. No one. We had seen no crew, and no conductor. The groan became a steady rumble. The lantern swung violently as the floorboards vibrated underfoot. Frank moved fast, heading back toward the entrance. Out, now, before... He froze. The door we had entered through was gone. Not stuck or warped. Gone. It was just a smooth black wall, iron seamless and unbroken. What the... Jonah's voice cracked. He rushed forward, pressing his palm to the metal. No. This was the door. This was the goddamn door. Alice slammed his fists against it, his voice rising. We walked through here. We walked through here. His shouts died in the heavy air, muffled like everything else. The train gathered speed. The rhythm of the wheels grew faster, pounding through the floor. It filled my chest like a second heartbeat. Jonah rattled the other door, the one at the far end. Locked. Son of a bitch won't... He slammed his shoulder into it. Then again, breath ragged. Nothing. I pressed to one of the windows, desperate for any glimpse of where we were. What I saw then wasn't the storm. The outside world was black, but not empty. Shapes moved in it, huge and slow, like silhouettes pressed just beyond the glass. They had no form I could name, only motion, writhing and endless. The sight made my head throb. I staggered back, bile burning in my throat. Jesus Christ, I whispered. Jonah grabbed my sleeve. What did you see? I shook my head, unable to answer him. Then the heat rose. The air pressed harder against my lungs. It smelled of scorched iron and old blood. Every surface of the train seemed to pulse with a dull vibration, like it wasn't carrying us through the dark, but bringing us deeper into it. We gathered in the aisle again, 4 men with lanterns trembling in our hands, staring at one another. Jonah's grin was long gone. Alice's pen had snapped in his grip, ink smeared across his palm, and Frank's calm had curdled into something brittle and desperate.